Hello and welcome to Black History Matters 2025. Today, we are looking at one of the most overlooked stories of the American Revolution, the role of Black and Indigenous soldiers in the fight for independence. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the Black Regiment at the Battle of Rhode Island, a group of Black Americans and Indigenous soldiers who played a pivotal role in one of the war's key battles. Their contributions challenge the traditional narrative of the American Revolution as one fought and won by a specific class of men, and reminds us that this country gained its independence with the efforts of a myriad of people, including those who are suffering discrimination. Learning about the Black Regiment at the Battle of Rhode Island reminds us that from the beginning of our nation's history, the United States has been constructed and won by the efforts of Black, brown, and white people alike. By the 18th century, tensions between the 13 colonies and Great Britain had reached a breaking point. The colonies resented British taxation without representation and various other laws imposed by the British. They sought independence, leading to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. Some contexts that led to the Revolutionary War were the French and Indian War, which occurred from 1754 through 1763, and which was a costly conflict between Britain and France over control of North American territory. While Britain emerged victorious, the war left it with enormous debt, leading Parliament to impose new taxes on the American colonies, such as the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Act of 1767, which fueled colonial resentment. Additionally, in an effort to avoid further conflicts with Native American nations, many of which had aided the French in the fight during the French and Indian War, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonial settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. Many colonists, especially land speculators and settlers eager to expand, viewed this as an unjust restriction on their economic and territorial ambitions. The combination of economic burdens and perceived British overreach throughout these taxation laws as well as restrictions contributed to the growing colonial unrest, ultimately setting the stage for the American Revolutionary War. I provide this context because it is important to understand that the American Revolutionary War was not fought solely for a loosely defined concept of freedom. Instead, it was largely fought because colonial elites in the original 13 colonies wanted to protect their economic control and privilege, while many other Americans sought to expand their territory, regardless of treaties with Native American nations. Therefore, while taxation without representation was part of the reason that the Revolutionary War began, so was the desire to expand at the detriment of Native American sovereignty, and of course to expand the land that could be cultivated with enslaved labor. The War for Freedom exposed deep contradictions in the American ideal. While white colonists fought for independence, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, and to some extent free Black people, remained in bondage or lived as second-class citizens, and indigenous nations faced continued land dispossession and violence at the hands of white settlers. During the 1770s, the 13 American colonies had a significant population of enslaved people, particularly in the South. By the time of the American Revolution, there were approximately 500,000 enslaved Africans in the colonies, making up about 20% of the total population. Slavery was deeply entrenched in the economies of the southern colonies, where large plantations relied on enslaved labor to produce cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. In the northern colonies, slavery was still present, but on a smaller scale, while enslaved individuals were working in households, docks, and small farms. Meanwhile, North America remained home to a vast and diverse indigenous population, with estimates suggesting between 1.5 to 2 million indigenous people spread across hundreds of nations. These nations, including the Cherokee, Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, Shawnee, Creek, and many others, controlled vast territories and played key roles in the geopolitical struggles between the British, French, and American colonists. many indigenous groups found themselves caught between competing colonial powers, forming strategic alliances based on their interests. However, the American Revolution, as subsequent westward expansion, would increasingly threaten their autonomy and land, setting the stage for decades of conflict and displacement. Therefore, during this time, both Black and Indigenous people were caught between competing alliances. Some fought for the British, who promised enslaved people their freedom if they joined the crown. Others sided with patriots, American colonials, hoping that military service would earn them respect, rights, and in some cases their freedom. Ultimately, it did not for many. However, one of the most striking examples of this was the Black Regiment of Rhode Island, an all-black unit that took center stage at the Battle of Rhode Island. For Black Americans, the war presented both an opportunity and a danger. Some states initially banned Black men from enlisting, fearing an armed Black population. However, as the war dragged on and troops were needed, attitudes shifted. On February 14, 1778, Rhode Island's General Assembly made a radical decision. Enslaved men who joined the military would be granted their freedom. This led to the creation of the First Rhode Island Regiment, commonly referred to as the Black Regiment, as it was primarily composed of Black American soldiers, although it also included indigenous men and some white men as well. The General Assembly said that, quote, every able-bodied Black, mulatto, or Indian man-slave, end quote, who chose to do so could serve, and voted that, quote, every slave so enlisting shall, upon his passing muster before Colonel Christopher Green, be immediately discharged from service of his master or mistress, and be absolutely free, end quote. The owners of enlisted slaves were to be compensated by the Assembly equal to their market value. Therefore, those who joined the regiment were promised their freedom, and their former masters would be compensated. Over the next 4 months, 88 enslaved men joined the regiment, along with several free Black and Native American recruits. The regiment ultimately grew to around 225 soldiers, with up to 140 of them being Black. The decision to enlist enslaved individuals was met with controversy, leading to a halt in non-white enlistments after June 1778. Despite this change, the regiment continued to be referred to as the quote-unquote Black Regiment, even as white soldiers were brought in to replenish its numbers, gradually transforming it into an integrated unit. For indigenous people, the war was deeply complex. Tribes such as the Narragansett, who had been in Rhode Island long before European colonization, found themselves divided, with some allying with the British and others joining the Patriot cause. Those who fought in the Black Regiment hoped that their participation would protect their communities and strengthen their standing in the new American society. The Battle of Rhode Island, fought on August 29, 1778, was a significant engagement in the American Revolutionary War as part of the larger effort to expel British forces from Newport, Rhode Island. At the time, Newport was a strategic port city occupied by the British since 1776, serving as a key naval base that allowed them to control shipping lanes and project power in New England. The battle was part of the first major joint military operation between the American Continental Army and their new French allies, marking an early test of Franco-American cooperation. Although the battle ended inconclusively, with the American forces withdrawing, it demonstrated the power of the Continental Army and its ability to stand against British and Hessian troops. The British maintained control of Newport until 1779. The battle, however, foreshadowed the eventual shift of the war to the Southern colonies' favor. On August 29, 1778, the Battle of Rhode Island occurred, as was just mentioned, and it became a defining moment for the Black Regiment. As American forces attempted to defend the island from the British, the Black Regiment was tasked with holding a strategic defensive position against Hessian forces, the German mercenaries who were fighting for the British. Despite being outnumbered and under intense fire, the Black Regiment held the line, preventing a major British advance. Their bravery not only saved American forces from a devastating loss, but also demonstrated the vital role Black and Indigenous soldiers played and would continue to play in the war. This battle was one of the few instances in the Revolutionary War where a predominantly Black unit saw direct combat, and their performance dispelled the racist myth that Black Americans lacked the courage or ability to fight. Black Americans had been involved in the Revolutionary War from the very beginning, fighting in an unofficial capacity at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, and serving in integrated militias throughout the conflict. However, the Continental Army officially barred Black recruits from enlisting between November 12, 1775 and February 23, 1778. Despite this restriction, enslaved men were frequently forced into service by their owners, who sought to avoid enlisting themselves, often without offering their enslaved men any freedom in return. As British officer Frederick Mackenzie observed in June 30th, 1777, the Continental Army was so desperate for soldiers that it enlisted enslaved men, paying their owners a bounty of $180 and half of their pay, while the enslaved soldier received the remaining half and a mere promise of freedom after 3 years. Sometimes that didn't even come to happen. One of the few units in the Continental Army to serve through the entire war, the Black Regiment participated in major battles from the Siege of Boston to the final disbanding of the Continental Army on November 3, 1783. The Rhode Island General Assembly had already promised freedom to the formerly enslaved men who fought in the war. On February 23, 1784, they took further action by passing a law that prohibited any person born in Rhode Island after March 1, 1784, from being enslaved. However, the law did not immediately free those who had already been enslaved. Instead, it required that children born to enslaved parents be financially supported by the town where they were born. At the same meeting, a colonel of the Black Regiment, having promised his men that he would advocate on their behalf, continued to push for government recognition of their freedom and fair compensation for their military service. Despite these promises, many Black veterans struggled financially. In June 1784, 13 Black veterans of the Rhode Island Regiment hired a lawyer to petition the War Department Accounts Office for the back pay they were owed. The image you see on the screen is one such Black back pay check. Their financial struggles were widespread, prompting the Rhode Island Assembly to pass a law on February 28, 1785, ensuring that any formerly enslaved soldier who was sick or unable to support himself could receive care from the town council where they lived. Some of these veterans stayed in Rhode Island, while others moved to 100-acre plots of bounty land granted to them in states like New York or Ohio. However, for most, economic hardships persisted. Many who survived entered the